Today, the biggest news and the biggest stories that people are talking about have to do with this election because we are literally 1 week out. Although voting has been taking place for weeks across this country, on Tuesday, November 5th, it is the last day, not the first day, but the last day of voting. And unlikely that on that night we will know the winner. If last election cycle was any indicator, it wasn't until Saturday after Election Day that we actually learned that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris had won that election. But there is a lot of polling out there. Some say Donald Trump and his team and those associated with the Republican Party are flooding the zone with fake polls that are skewed to suggest that Donald Trump is winning. They say he's doing that so that in the event that he loses, he'll be able to make the argument that how could I possibly have lost when all of these polls had me up by considerable margins across the country? Well, some say that's yet a tactic that he hopes to use in the event of a loss. But there are some reputable polling sources out there, but even those are telling a very conflicting story of the state of this race. Again, as you know, I've been on this 7-state Battleground tour, and a part of that has been talking to voters, it's been talking to pollsters, it's been talking to people in the Democratic National Committee party. It's been talking to members of the Harris-Walz team. And I've been getting lots of poll information from these various sources. And I can tell you that the polls are all over the place. And if you are a Democrat, like I'm sure many of you are, you know that we are traditionally very much anxious. We're anxious as a party. We tend to worry a whole lot. Remember the red wave that was supposed to happen when, it didn't come to fruition, but we were so worried about Republicans sweeping the House and the Senate a couple of years ago. Well, that same level of anxiety is very present in the battleground states. I'm sitting now in North Carolina, where I will be out knocking doors tomorrow night. Wednesday, I'll also be at 3rd and Fernwood. It is an African-American owned spot at 1100 Metropolitan in the city of Charlotte, North Carolina. If you are in Charlotte or know anyone that lives in Charlotte, make sure you come by, check us out at 6 p.m. tomorrow night. Again, it's 3rd and Fernwood. It is an African-American spot. We're going to be playing some great music, providing some complimentary food. You'll be able to purchase some drinks and support a Black business while engaging with local elected officials, community leaders, and others. We're going to be in conversation about how does North Carolina make up the 74,000 votes that went for Donald Trump and gave the state to him in the election in 2020. Again, we're going to be talking about what North Carolina voters, particularly Black voters, need to do to ensure that Donald Trump doesn't have a repeat of 2020, and that is win this state again. So to help us make sense of all of these conflicting polls, we have an expert joining us. Y'all know I love my experts. I don't like to get out of my lane. And so when we have these kind of thorny issues, it's always good to talk to someone who has their fingers on the pulse, who has spent their entire career working on the issue at hand. And so in this hour, I'm going to be talking to Dr. Tabitha Bonilla. She is a polling expert. She's a co-founder and head of a strategy group that works on campaigns. She has a lot of experience working on national campaigns, polling different demographics, and helping folks understand where elections are, particularly tight races like this presidential race. So when we come forward, we're going to be talking to a polling expert about which of these polls should we believe, which ones should we just ignore, and should we be really at this late date, a week before the election, even paying attention to any of the polls. These polls, doctor, are all over the place. Has Democrats, as you know, who are traditionally very nervous, love to clutch our pearls, love to get anxious, love to think about the worst case scenario in elections. But I don't know what to make of them. I was in Philadelphia yesterday talking to some experts. They said that nationally, the Black male vote for Kamala Harris was at 74%, but it was lower in Pennsylvania. And then I saw something today that said Black male votes for Kamala Harris is at 85%. Help us understand. We're going to talk about different demographics throughout this hour. I want to start with Black men because they've been so much the subject of conversation. This, narrative that was spun, I think, mostly by media, that they were defecting in huge numbers, either to Donald Trump or third-party candidates, or just sitting out this election altogether. Now, on the ground, talking to Black men, they're saying that that's a farce, that that's not true, that Black men are likely to, be at 85, if not higher, because traditionally they're the second most reliable voting bloc for Democrats behind Black women. So tell us what's happening first with Black men. Then, like I said, we'll talk about some other demographics.
All right, sounds good. So I think, as you pointed out, the polls are all over the place. And part of this is because so many different decisions go into who to poll. And it matters a lot where we're polling. And I think the controversies around Black men really stem from this idea that we assume that they're going to show up in very high numbers for the Democratic Party, as they traditionally have done. And I think part of the reason we're seeing so many differences is because there's a real age gap in Black male voters. So when our firm has been sampling Black voters since last year, and we've noticed a pretty sizable gender gap between Black men and Black women in support for Democratic candidate. But one of the most striking things we've started noticing over the spring and summer is that older Black men do show up for Democrats in very high numbers, so very close to that 80-85% that you're talking about. But younger Black men are actually quite low relative to that. We've seen as low as 50% of support for Gen Z and millennial voters in some of our polls. So it could be, and it's hard to say without looking at all the polls, it could be the fact that some of these polls are capturing different age cohorts. And that's one of the differences. And, part of that might be who's easy for the pollsters to access based on where they're trying to get people's information.
So, okay, what is your polling saying in Battleground say? So if you're saying your polling is around 80 to 85% for Black men, middle age, or just millennials, I'll start with that, and that for younger Black men, Gen Z, it's around 50%. Is that true nationwide, or is that true for Battleground states? Where do those numbers apply to?
So our most recent polling has been nationwide. We have found the Battleground states don't look that drastically different in our samples from the national polls. And we have seen this, this gap between older men and younger men throughout. So I think our most recent Battleground poll, unfortunately, was about a month ago, which at this point feels a little out of date, but it did show a pretty similar breakdown of around 80 to 85% for older Black men and around 55 to 60% for younger Black men.
Does that surprise you? Because you think about younger people, generally more progressive, right? You would think perhaps not as sexist as older Black men, would be more aligned with a candidate that doesn't, fit the traditional profile of who's been president in this country, a candidate that has gone on podcasts, that has, been a part of HBCU events, has made colleges and universities a big part of her campaigning. So when I think about what Kamala Harris has done, particularly related to young people, I would think that those numbers amongst younger people would be higher. But what are we missing there?
So I think there are different motivations. So I think you're talking about, possibly one thing driving the gender gap among Black voters is sexism. And I think that you're right. I think that is possibly a part of it. And I think it's more likely to be true for older Black men than it is for younger Black men. And a lot of our polling, some of the things we're finding with younger voters, there's some people who are upset about foreign policy, about what's playing out in Gaza. There are people who are really upset about the economy and feeling like nothing anybody does is really affecting them and making their life better. And I think the last thing to be mindful of is, for this demographic, it's harder to actually go and vote. And so this lack of interest, or the lack of willingness to just pick the Democratic candidate because that's what's expected of you, might be a little bit less, just because you haven't been doing this for years and years, as older Black men have done.
Okay, so what is your polling saying about Black women? We know, again, the most reliable voting bloc for all Democrats historically has been Black women. I've seen some polls that say Black women are in the 90s, like over 90% breaking for Kamala Harris. Is that consistent? And doesn't seem to be a differential based on age. So it's not like younger women are polling less than. It seems like just kind of in a monolithic way, Black women are solidly, like I said, in the 90%. Is that consistent with what your polling is showing?
So we do see a little bit of an age gap among Black women as well, but it's much less drastic than among Black men. So on average, we're seeing in the low to mid 80s for Black women support of Kamala Harris, but older Black women are almost at 90%, while younger Black women are closer to 80%. So there is a little bit of a variation, but when we're talking a much smaller gap, right? This is subject, of course, to some margin of error. And so I don't think our numbers are that inconsistent from a read for some Black women at 90%. But on average, we're seeing closer to 85.
So we know, Doctor, that both candidates have been making a big play for Latino voters. Kamala Harris has done town halls with Telemundo. She has spent a lot of time in battleground states like Arizona, where there are large Latino populations. We know Donald Trump has also been making a big play for Latino voters. In the 2020 election, Latinos broke overwhelmingly for Joe Biden compared to Donald Trump. And again, like Black men, there was talk leading up to this election next week that Latinos were, falling out from the Democratic Party, some because of abortion issues, some Latinos being, religiously conservative, others around the economy. What are your polls showing for Latino voters? And we break it down in terms of Latino men who may, again, have been subject of news articles that they identify more with Donald Trump because of the whole machismo, the male kind of image, the I'll call it, toxic male identity that he portrays. So where are we with Latino voters?
Yeah, so funny enough, we mostly focused on Black voters in our polls, so we have not a ton that speaks to the entire Latino population. But I think it's worth pointing out two things. First, I think this demographic is subject to almost the entire same narrative that we hear about Black voters, right? There's this outsized proportion of people who are going for Donald Trump, and the polling isn't really indicating that. It is indicating small drop-offs compared to 2020, but certainly nothing near a majority of Latinos are supporting Donald Trump. One thing that we have seen is that Latina women are very favorable toward Kamala Harris and breaking much more supportive than not of her. And so I don't have a good gender gap from our data, but we do see from other pollsters a pretty big gender gap between women and men who are Latino, but it is, much relatively consistent with what we'd expect from other election cycles.
What do you think, if any, this Sunday night debacle, Madison Square Garden, the racist, attacks on Puerto Ricans, the backlash, the coming out by Bad Bunny, J-Lo, Ricky Martin, and other high-profile Puerto Ricans, artists and performers and celebrities, Puerto Ricans being the second largest Latino voting bloc in this country, and having hundreds of thousands in many of the key battleground states. Do you think that will have an impact on Latino voters in any of those margins?
I think on the small number of Latino voters who have not decided, I think that this probably will have impact, but I think we're already seeing kind of the Donald Trump response. Today, there was, there are Puerto Rican people speaking in favor, talking about Donald Trump himself was saying, no one has done more for Puerto Rico than I have as president. So I think voters tend to be inclined to confirm what they already believe from what they're hearing. And so unless you weren't already focused on a candidate and thinking that someone was going to meet your needs, this might not have a ton of impact. That said, we're in a pretty close race. In all the swing states, there's There's not a lot of room for error for either party. And so something like this actually could be enough to bring a few more voters and mobilize them against Donald Trump.
So, Doctor, one of the things that people ask me all the time, how in the world could this election be so close? People look at these two candidates and the stark differences. One, a convicted felon who's been adjudicated as a rapist that is still facing federal, criminal charges. One that has, created so much chaos when in office. And another one that has a track record, of success as a senator, as a vice president, as an attorney general. People are having a real hard time understanding how is the race so close when Donald Trump has what traditionally would have been so many things in his past and present that would make him, that would disqualify him even to be on the ticket.
I think we talk a lot about this in trying to understand just the change in the tenor of the candidates, but also about what voters are talking about and what they're thinking about in terms of who to vote for. And I think this is a really clear example of how things have changed, of what polarization has allowed people to find acceptable. And I think this is one of the difficulties of having two parties who feel so far apart, when some people are, willing to excuse, what happened on January 6th, or the fact that Donald Trump is a convicted felon, or dehumanizing language at rallies, either because I think for some people they agree with some of these things, but for some people, and I think frankly a significant portion, are probably voting for this party because they think that this is the better option. Democrats may have gone too far in the other direction. So it's difficult because these are things, traditional values, and I think many political scientists are concerned about the turn of how voters are thinking about accountability, who they'll hold accountable, and for what.
And we know that the gender, I should say, of the candidates is playing some role. Have the polls been able to depict or determine what role, how significant of a role is the fact that Kamala Harris is a female? Are the polls showing us that for a lot of voters, that's an issue?
I honestly, at this point, I don't know that I've been able to suss this out from the polls. I think typically this takes us just a little bit longer, only because, we need multiple steps of this analysis. We need to know how people are thinking about gender. We need to know why they're supporting who. I suspect that we will find that her gender is going to matter quite a bit, as will her race and background as a migrant. I think we also hear it in the ways that people talk about her, and the way that people are willing to minimize her expertise and her track record, as you have pointed out earlier in the show.
Well, it's very interesting. There is a way, though, that pollsters like yourself will be able to post this election,
yes,
ferret out that information. I mean, we know some of it from Hillary Clinton's unsuccessful run in 2016 and the role that gender played in terms of her race. But obviously now we have gender plus race that has to be, factored in. When we come forward, I'm going to talk about white women, because obviously they are such a critical part of this election. A lot of people believe that, unlike when Hillary Clinton ran, because of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision, that there may be a different calculation for white women who voted overwhelmingly for Trump in 2016 and then again in 2020. The question is this going to be a new day? Because unlike those two election cycles, you did not have, this overturning of Roe v. Wade. Polls taken since October 23 have mixed results, some with Harris ahead in some, Trump taking the lead in others, and some showing a tie. However, no polls are showing margins beyond a few points outside the margin of error, meaning that the candidates are in an effective deadlock. This is a little concerning, of course, for Democrats, who won the popular vote of the last 8 elections, excluding 2004 when George W. Bush was reelected. Since the Republican Party enjoys an advantage in the Electoral College, such close national numbers are alarming to the Harris campaign. A lot of folks don't necessarily, Dr. Bonilla, appreciate the difference between the popular vote and how you win the presidency through the Electoral College. Help us have a better understanding of that, because we know that Donald Trump, likes to think that in the last election, could not believe that he lost the election because he talked about we get 70 million plus votes, but he didn't win the Electoral College. So just give us a little brief primer on what's the difference between winning the popular vote and winning the Electoral College.
Yeah, so the popular vote is just the raw vote counts. So if we were to have just a popularity contest as a way we decide president in terms of number of votes, then the person who got the number of votes would win. And often that is the Democrat, including actually in 2020, despite what Donald Trump has claimed. But because the Electoral College assigns a number of electorates to each state by the population in the state, it means that our votes don't necessarily translate directly into support of the candidate. It matters for what state we live in. And some states have a lot more electorates per person than others. So highly populous states like California, New York, which are very Democrat states, have a lot fewer or a lot more people per electorate than a lot of rural states, which tend to be Republican strongholds. And so in this way, Democrats can stack up the popular vote and still lose in the Electoral College if a lot of the more rural states tend to vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah, a lot of people find that just confusing and not a fair process, but obviously until we do away with the Electoral College, that is the way that it is, which is why there's so much focus right now in those battleground states. Pennsylvania, for one, has 19 Electoral College votes, so it's one of the biggest prize of the 7 swing states. Let me ask you about a story that's been in the news lately about polls, and it's that Donald Trump and Republican-related entities are flooding the zone with polls that show him winning, so that one, they can impact the average, because polls are typically, they take 4 or 5 together, add them together, then divide them by the number of polls to get an average of all the polls. And so some believe that this is a strategy that he's using so that if he does lose, he'll be able to point to these polls and say, there had to be cheating because I was up by, X percentage in all of these polls. Is it possible to manipulate polling in that fashion?
So I think there's a couple different pieces of your question that, if you don't mind indulging me, I'd love to break down. So the first piece that I want to kind of talk about is, can a poll affect how people show up or how they vote? And the answer is yes. This is one of the things that researchers talk about as affecting the 2016 race. So if you remember, most of the polls were saying Hillary Clinton was almost a sure win. And then, of course, she loses. And one of the things that researchers have found is that by reporting that she was almost certainly to win, it may have caused voters to actually stay home because they thought they didn't need to go vote because it was already in the bag for her. But the second thing that I think is really important here to think about is if you can manipulate polling outcome, and the answer is absolutely, right? We know a lot about how finicky polls are, right? There's a lot of decision making that goes into who's taking the polls. Are those people representative of the places that we're trying to poll? Do they have opinions of the people who are going to show up to vote on election day? And so you can easily manipulate these things. Independent of that, though, if you are reporting that the polls say that you are ahead, what this could do is set us up for another type of way to have a contention around the election result, like we saw the last time, right? This is one of the reasons people claim that they were so upset, why we saw January 6th happen. And so if this could be similarly setting people up for this expectation that Donald Trump will win. And if he doesn't, right, it gears people up to protest, to not accept the election result, and to think that there might be some kind of electoral impropriety, like we thought there might, like some people thought there was in 2020. So I do think that is concerning, because if we lose trust in our electoral systems, that's a pretty bad thing for democracy.
Well, what do you make? I mean, is it possible that Republican-leaning pollsters are flooding the zone with, polls that are skewed towards Donald Trump for that very purpose of creating this illusion that he had to have won because the polls said he was up? Is that happening? Or how would we know if that's happening?
I don't think that we can know if that's happening. I mean, short of someone writing it down and releasing a memo to us, I think it's really difficult to know. I do think Republican pollsters are likely making very different decisions than Democratic pollsters about who is in the communities, who they think the likely pool of voters are. And I see this, and I don't think it's controversial, because often Democratic polls and Republican polls have slightly different outcomes. So I think this is partly why when you see a poll released, there's typically with it some information about the people who are polled, about their racial breakdown, their age. And we also want to see something called the margin of error, which kind of tells us how much certainty we have about the estimates these pollsters are making. So we can definitely look at Republican polls and talk about potential bias in those polls, but that doesn't quite get us to the decision-making process that Republican pollsters are making.
So there's one of these polls out recently says that Harris has received a boost among Hispanic and suburban women voters going into the final week before the campaign. This poll finds that she has a 2-point advantage among registered voters at 49 versus 47% over Donald Trump. And this is with women, again, Hispanic and white women, suburban women. What do you make of that? I mean, and we know white women are a big part of the strategy and the hope that the Democratic Party will see a surge in white women voting Democratic because of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision. What are your polls telling you about the likelihood of white women breaking in this race for Kamala Harris? And does it break down by age?
Great question. So white women have never voted in majority for anyone but Donald Trump in an election where he's ran. So I would be really surprised if more than 50% of white women voters vote for Kamala Harris in this election. It would just be a really big jump. That said, we do know that younger, more educated white women do vote more, or do support Kamala Harris more so than they do Donald Trump. So I do think we'll probably see closer to 50% than we've seen in the past, but I would be surprised if we break 50%, despite that being a big piece of the Democrat strategy.
So that's very interesting, and wow, wow to that, particularly given how the issue of abortion is not just polling, but how it has been performing even in red states like Ohio, Kentucky. Ballots are, ballot initiatives are on the ballot in many states to enshrine abortion rights into, state constitutions, even a state like Missouri, that's a red state. So when you look at how that has been driving white women voters as well as women of color, you don't see a parallel in how those voters are going to go and vote, say, for enshrining abortion rights in Missouri, to voting for Kamala Harris, who talks about a federal law that would reinstate the rights under Roe v. Wade. Yes. And what's your thought on that? Big question. I'm sure you have a lot to say on that. We'll get to it on the other side, because it's a little disheartening to hear that you don't think white women are going to get above 50%, but hey, we might as well get the truth so that we aren't disillusioned like we were in the 2016 election. Before we went to break, the question was about white women, and you made the revelation that historically white women never vote at greater percentages than 50% for Democratic candidates, and you had no reason to expect it to be different this year. And I was wondering how come that number wouldn't be larger, not so much because of Kamala Harris, but because of the issue of Dobbs and the overturning of Roe v. Wade and Kamala Harris's commitment, unlike Donald Trump's, to restoring abortion rights as a federal statute, and just her, passionate and intense support of women's reproductive freedoms and body autonomy. Just seems like how that abortion issue has been performing in red states all over the country, that alone would perhaps cause there to be a greater number of percentage, I should say, of white women voting for the Democratic candidate.
Yeah, so I think there will be a higher percentage of white women voting for the Democrat candidate than we've seen. But, in 2020, it was about 46% of white women voting. For me, I think even moving that to 48 or 49% is a lot of movement for a demographic in a single election cycle. I do think, two things. One, I think abortion is incredibly mobilizing. Dobbs was a really consequential decision. We ran a survey with She the People in September, and we found, if Kamala Harris talks about protecting abortion rights for women, this was highly mobilizing for white women. And I think that's, that's really important. And to your point, I think white women really think about this. Unfortunately, even if people are mobilizing to work on, protection and embedding this right in state constitutions through referenda, however, people are mobilizing for it, it also doesn't necessarily translate into support for a partisan person, right? So if you tend to be more conservative, you might still, vote to protect abortion rights at the state level, but not choose to do that through a candidate. And so just really traditionally that Republican Party candidate or party has really been a home for the majority of white women. And I would be surprised if that entirely goes away, even given the stakes.
And that's what I was going to ask you, because what are the percentages when you look at white women? What percentages of them are registered as Democrats? What percentage are registered as Republican, and then others as independents?
That's actually a good question. I have to confess, I don't know off the top of my head. I know how people have voted, but not necessarily their registration. And so I could,
historically, white women have voted over 50% for Republican candidates.
That's correct. There's I think one election, I want to say one election, I can't remember which one, where they may have surpassed that 50% threshold Democrat, but for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020, there was majority white women voting for him. So I also say that as an important piece, because I think it has always been talked about that Donald Trump is not good for women, concerns about how he would handle abortion. And so, it's significant that Dobbs happened and many more women now lack protection than used to. And also, right, those things were always a topic of the conversation in elections when he has run for president and have not shifted white women in large numbers.
And so when those white women are polled post 2016, post 2020, what is the explanation for why they support Donald Trump? Are there single issues like the economy, or like what is the rationale for supporting someone that has, taken positions that are adverse to them?
Yeah, I think the economy, I think immigration, I think many of the same topics that you would expect Republicans to say matter are also mattering to these women and mattering more, right? And I think it's also, I think it's really important also to point out, right, this does matter by education. So once we see college-educated women, right, they're at college-educated white women, I think, in some of the and one poll I was looking at, we're at about 60% support for Kamala Harris compared to, closer to 42% or lower for not college educated white women. So education makes a really big difference here. And I think that's a pretty important, piece of information to pay attention to.
And the last demographic we haven't talked about we haven't talked about several others, but the one we'll end on is white men. Where are white men polling for Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump?
So there's like we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, whereas there's a gender gap among Black men and women, there's also one among white men and white women. And the gender gap between white men and white women, I think, in this election cycle seems to be, typical of as it has been. And I think also runs very much along the lines of education, just like with women. So more educated white men tend to be lean Democratic, while less educated white men tend to lean very strongly Republican.
Mm-hmm. So if you were advising someone who's reading the polls every day, how do they know which of the polls are accurate, which of the ones are reliable, which are the ones that they should even, follow or consume?
That's such a good question. And I kind of want to say the pollsters disagree too with each other. And they will sit there and poke holes at other people's polls. So I think what I would say is, I think, obviously, as someone who runs some of my own, I want you to say, hey, we have important things to say. But I think that, polls shouldn't be what makes your decision for how you vote or whether you decide to vote. To me, those should be very separate things, but they can inform some of your decisions about, if you want to donate to someone, if you want to go help canvass. And so I think what I would say is kind of look across polls, look to see if there are long-term trends, look to see how people have historically measured up in their polls, and also look to see, if someone's the only person saying something, it might be worth paying attention to, but it might also be, something you have to watch out for. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it can be really tricky.
Vet the polls, I think, is the summary of the message.
That's correct.
Of your message. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bonilla. This is clearly such a nerve-wracking time for us. Everybody's on pins and needles. This election is 1 week off, which everyone I think that I've talked to in the Battleground states can't wait for next Wednesday to come. There's been so much work, so much anxiety around this race. Again, I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, broadcasting live today. I will be at 3rd and Fernwood tomorrow night, Wednesday at 6 p.m. Join us, 1100 Metropolitan Avenue. I'm going to continue to share with you folks I'm meeting on the streets in Battleground states. Again, we're going to keep a close eye on this election.